Hello, dear viewers. You are on the Moto channel. After quite a long forced break, this is the first big story on the channel, and we will talk with you about motorcycles intended for law enforcement agencies. Where and when did a two-wheeled machine with an engine in the frame first enter into service? What motorcycles did the Soviet police use? Why, during the Great Depression, were American Harleys in Detroit and Chicago equipped with armored plates? Why is BMV equipment so popular in the agencies of many countries? And how did the French gendarmes lose the project for the people's motorcycle with a Citroën engine? You will learn about all this and much more in this episode. I invite you to hear a few words about police motorcycles. It will be interesting. Dear viewers, before I start, let me briefly introduce myself. This story and others like it require significant effort to gather information, write the script, do the voiceover, edit, and handle post-production. The most enjoyable part at this stage, when the story is uploaded, is seeing the audience's reaction and how quickly the views increase. But not all such videos are equally lucky. For example, the detailed episode about the motorcycle race on the Isle of Man stalled at 33,000 views. So let's make a deal. If you think the episode is informative, useful, and of good enough quality, please don't hesitate to share it with your friends and acquaintances, to anyone who is interested in and cares about two-wheeled vehicles. Thank you. Motorcycles first appeared in the late 1800s. Initially, like all novel inventions, these were prototypes and experimental models with two primary objectives: to evaluate their driving capabilities and to assess society's reaction. Is it ready for this innovation or not? The Hildebrandt Wolfmüller was the first mass-produced motorcycle in history, which was produced from 1894 to 1897 by the Germans, brothers Heinrich and Wilhelm Hildebrandt and Alois Wolfmüller. The emergence of other companies mass-producing motorcycles did not take long. From 1900 and in the following years, motorcycle companies sprang up like mushrooms after the rain, and the motorcycle, as a child of the era of progress, was gaining more and more popularity. Let's step away from two-wheeled vehicles for a moment and recall a bit from the history of law enforcement agencies. What did the tough police officers of the 19th century use to get around? For the most part, they rode horses individually. Various types of horse-drawn carriages were also used to transport personnel or to carry offenders. The 19th century was the age of steam. The steam locomotive is practically a symbol of that era, and, by the way, also of the early 20th century. And the police also used railway cars to escort prisoners or to transport valuable cargo and weapons. In the last decades of the 19th century, the bicycle was gaining popularity. It's a convenient and unpretentious thing for patrolling both in the city and in rural areas. Around the same time, cars and motorcycles began appearing. And law enforcement agencies, which, by the way, had money, couldn't ignore these technical innovations that would make it easier, faster, and more convenient to perform their duties. It's a bit off topic, but do you know where and when a car was first put into police service? This happened in the United States in the city of Akron, Ohio, in 1899. This four-wheeled car with an electric motor was used for patrolling. This carriage could accelerate up to 26 kilometers per hour and had a range of 48 kilometers. The first driver was Louis Mueller, and the first assignment was to pick up a drunk person from the streets of Akron. As for the first use of a motorcycle in service, most sources prefer to give the honor to Harley Davidson technology. In 1908, a batch of 4 motorcycles from this company was officially purchased by the Detroit Police Department. In the same year, the police department of the town of Evanston, Illinois, purchased an Excelsior Henderson motorcycle for patrolling. In 1909, Indian motorcycles were used in various divisions. Some sources claim the first in-service motorcycle was an Indian. The two-wheeled machine designed by Hedstrom and Hendy was purchased by the New York Police in 1907. The officers saw the motorcycle as a valuable tactical tool that gave them an advantage in fighting crime thanks to its speed and mobility. Soon, other police departments across the United States followed this example and began purchasing two-wheeled vehicles. This allowed motorcycle manufacturers to make good money on government contracts and improve their financial situation. The first official motorcycle patrol, as a separate unit, was organized in Berkeley, California in 1911 by the Chief of Police Augusto Fulmer. Here in Berkeley, the requirements for training police motorcyclists were established for the first time, and Harley Davidson and Indian motorcycles were additionally equipped with leather side bags for carrying necessary service items. However, look at this situation. It is quite possible that before the delivery of the Indian, in 1907 to the New York Police and the first Harley entering service in 1908, some law enforcement officers may have privately used their own motorcycles. Police officers primarily use motorcycles to enforce traffic regulations and as escort vehicles. From the very beginning, a number of requirements were imposed on the equipment in service, and the most important one was that the motorcycle had to have good dynamic performance in order to successfully pursue any vehicle on the road and quickly arrive at the designated location. That is why the police, both back then and mostly even now, choose high-displacement, powerful vehicles. Even at the dawn of motorcycle use by law enforcement, it became clear that personnel needed training in extreme riding, as well as instruction in maintenance and repair of the vehicles. Gradually, the requirements expanded to include equipping the motorcycle with specialized equipment. Nowadays, this includes special sound signals, light signaling, photo and video recording devices, radio communication, navigation, and so on. However, perhaps the earliest invention, well, except for the leather saddlebags for the patrol motorcycle, was the speedometer needle lock. What was it needed for? To catch a speeding driver, the police officer would match the patrol car's speed to the civilian's vehicle, locking the speedometer reading. After stopping the violator, the officer could use the locked reading as evidence. They could present something like this. Look, you were speeding down the road like crazy, 40 miles per hour. I'm issuing you a ticket, and you'll need to pay a fine. Another fairly early invention was a special sound signal with a mechanical drive. In these frames, we can see one of these devices. It is activated in the manner of a bicycle dynamo from the tire of the wheel. After their introduction in the United States, police forces in other nations, like Great Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, also began using motorcycles, initially in more technologically advanced nations. For example, in France, this happened in 1910, and in Britain, it officially happened in 1921. And later, even countries that didn't have their own motorcycle production appreciated their value. Here's an example: a motorcycle police show in Mexico in 1937, or in Australia in the mid-30s. Here, another important criterion for using motorcycles was the climate. In areas where winter was really harsh, with snow and strong frosts, or where winter was either absent or very short, using motorcycles for service made sense. In countries where it's winter, outside for half the year, a car or the good old horse was preferable, since in conditions with half-meter snowdrifts, a horse could outperform motor vehicles in terms of getting through. Another important criterion that affects what kind of equipment is used in peacetime service is the economic condition of the state at a given time. It's simple here. A motorcycle is inherently cheaper than a car because it requires less material and less labor to produce. For instance, In post-war Europe, late 1940s, early 1960s, the post-war Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, etc., motorcycles were widely used by the internal affairs and traffic control agencies. By the way, there were even motorcycles for fire departments, which we will talk about with you someday. This chapter will delve into the vibrant history of police motorcycles in the United States, likely the most colorful chapter in the story of motorcycles used in law enforcement. From the previous chapter, you remember that it was in the States where a two-wheeled vehicle first entered into service. Indian in New York in 1907, and a year later, Harley Davidson in Detroit. The first decade of the 20th century in the United States of America was marked by the beginning of mass automobile production. For this, we have to thank Henry Ford and his methods of assembly line automobile production. Thanks to this approach, the automobile stopped being a luxury item. The more Ford models were produced, the cheaper they became. So, the Ford Model T in the 1908-1910 S cost $825 to $850, and by 1917 it was only $350. The increase in the number of vehicles on the roads was insane. Here's some numbers to give you an idea. The total number of trucks and passenger cars in the United States grew from 8,000 in 1900 to 1,258,000 in 1913. And as a result, the number of traffic violations, speeding, accidents, and deaths on the roads increased dramatically. And in order to somehow improve the situation, the authorities decided to expand the staff of the traffic police and to massively motorize their divisions. In the 1910s, the number of motorcycles in service increased rapidly, and these were not just models from the two most well-known American motorcycle brands. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were a lot of manufacturers of two-wheelers in the United States of America, most of whom could not survive the Great Depression. In the garages of police departments, you could find equipment from A, C, E, Excelsior, Pierce, Henderson, and so on. In particular, cops grew fond of the Henderson inline fours. It was a solid and very reliable machine, 968 cc 7 horsepower, and on early models, an incredibly long wheelbase of 1,650 millimeters. In 1914, the First World War began. Initially, there was a strong desire in the states to remain neutral. However, after a series of events on April 6, 1917, Congress declared war on Germany. The United States immediately expanded the scale of economic and naval assistance to the Allies and began preparing an expeditionary force to enter combat on the front. Industry supplied the Army with a significant number of motorcycles, and after the war ended, a large amount of surviving motor vehicles was transferred to the police. It would still be useful there because a war against banditry was brewing. There was a period in the history of the United States called Prohibition, which lasted from 1920 to 1933. Do you think people just obediently stopped drinking during that period? Not at all. People got around the ban by any means possible, and during this period, so-called bootlegging developed. Alcohol was produced illegally, smuggled in from abroad, and armed gangs were organized to control this entire illegal process. And on the other side of the barricades were the policemen. It was a real war, and in the hottest spots of the country, you could see police motorcycles like these, with armored shields for both the driver and the sidecar passenger. The situation was grave. Amidst the usual crime fighting, there were also notable achievements. For example, motorcycle patrol officers, Thornton Edwards on an Indian and Stanley Baker on a Harley Davidson, were on duty on the evening of March 12, 1928, when one of the worst natural disasters in United States history struck California. Shortly after midnight, the newly built St. Francis Dam collapsed 36 kilometers upstream on the Valencia River. A devastating torrent of water rushed straight toward the town of Santa Paula. The local police department learned about the impending danger soon after the dam collapsed. Thornton and Baker spent 3 hours racing around Santa Paula on motorcycles, warning residents about the evacuation of the town. According to legend, Thornton's motorcycle had to be repaired because that night it took in a lot of water. As a result of the actions of these two officers, many residents were successfully evacuated, and the number of casualties was significantly reduced. Also, from the interesting facts, there is this video from approximately the 1920s, in which you can see a motorcycle with a cage in the sidecar. The policeman stops the offender in the car, detains him, and takes him to the station in that very cage. So this is a humorous skit. It's obvious that the bars are fake, and the little white chair was clearly taken from the nearest terrace. Besides, it's illogical. While being in this cage, the detainee could easily interfere with the officer in charge of the equipment in many ways. He could also, without much effort, steal the keys or the service weapon.
I'm not going to wish a summons on any of you good people sitting out there in your comfortable theater seats. I've driven my motorbike right into the middle of this screen.
According to Harley and Davidson, by the end of the 1920s, more than 3,000 police departments and government agencies were using motorcycles of this brand. The Great Depression of 1929 hit manufacturers hard. Sales dropped every year, and many companies went out of business. In fact, after the crisis, only the big three American motorcycle manufacturers survived: Excelsior, Indian, and Harley Davidson. The latter managed to stay afloat thanks to aggressive marketing of their motorcycles to the police and government agencies, as well as participating in national road safety campaigns. By the way, during that period, policemen actively used not only Harley's two-wheeled models and sidecar versions, but also the three-wheeled Servicar, which appeared in 1931. The average American patrol officer in the early 30s would ride about 100,000 kilometers a year in any weather on a service motorcycle. The road surfaces in those years were of poor quality. Dirt roads, mud, potholes, and other things that would make an enduro rider happy dominated 80% of the country's territory. Before World War II, police Harleys were usually painted dark blue, and since 1951, they have been painted a special dark silver color. Harley-Davidson got through World War II relatively well, since they managed to create the simplest and most reliable Army motorcycle, the WLA-42. Indian wasn't so lucky, and by 1953 they went bankrupt. The United States saw an economic boom in the 1950s and 1960s, with crime rates lower than in the 1920s. But the situation on the roads didn't go away and even got worse. The number of people on the roads kept growing, engine sizes and speeds increased, and as a result, the number of accidents and deaths also rose. Use with access to vehicles exacerbated the situation. Youth are essentially the same everywhere and always. Simply provide them a cause to compete in anything, such as speed. American youth had plenty of jalopies and beat-up cars, and they would organize races and drag runs everywhere. Naturally, they didn't go to a track or a stadium for this. They did everything right on public roads. Patrol motorcyclists were tasked with preventing accidents, enforcing speed limits, and dispersing all sorts of street racer gatherings. For this purpose, special motorcycle units were formed in many cities. Usually they were given rather simple names: traffic enforcement or motorcycle units. But in some cities, they chose really striking names. How do you like, for example, Pittsburgh Hot Rod Squad? The most famous among the squads was the Tennessee Yellow Jackets. The policemen rode Harleys, painted bright yellow, with additional yellow stickers on the windshields along with the usual police markings. The officers wore black leather motorcycle boots, black trousers with a yellow stripe, a yellow shirt with black pocket flaps, and a black tie. Depending on the weather, they wore a yellow jacket with black trim. The Tennessee Yellow Jackets division existed for only 6 months before it was reorganized, but it left an indelible impression. The officers who served in it continued to wear the special uniform and use yellow motorcycles for several years, and many other divisions copied this style. The image of a cop on a Harley became an icon of American style, a symbol of the era. And until the mid-60s, no one could have imagined that they would be riding foreign-made machines. The virtual monopoly of the only motorcycle manufacturer on the domestic market spoiled it. Technical innovations were introduced extremely slowly and lazily, and a number of foreign brands managed to surpass Harley Davidson in many respects. In the 1960s, motorcycles from BMW made their way to the United States of America and soon began to push Harley Davidson out of service. In the second half of the 1960s, the Italian company Motogoods launched the production of large displacement V-twins, which became so popular with the police that they were even adopted for service in sunny California. On the horizon, the Japanese were looming, confidently entering the United States market. And as soon as the Japanese Big Four introduced machines with decent displacement and power, they started to attract the interest of law enforcement agencies. The share of Japanese police motorcycles was insignificant until the 70s. The Honda CB 450 and CB 750 were among the first motorcycles modified for police use. Stock production motorcycles were equipped with special police gear, a loud siren, a pair of flashing beacons, and a luggage rack for placing a radio and an emergency kit. However, by the late 70s and early 80s, the Japanese had significantly pushed Harley-Davidson and BMW out of the law enforcement sector. In 1975, Kawasaki released a special kit for the Z1900 model, turning it into a police motorcycle. After that, they began producing serial models for police departments. All of them were equipped with windshields, side cases, flashing beacons, a siren, and radio communication. The most popular model was the Kawasaki KZ1000P Polaris, also known as KZ Pi. Released in 1982, the model was produced in the United States of America at a factory in the town of Lincoln, Nebraska. With minor changes, all for maximum standardization, the model was produced until 2005. Police on the United States West Coast favored Kawasaki, while East Coast officers stayed loyal to Harleys. BMWs were distributed relatively evenly across the country. In the last 10 to 15 years, there has once again been a trend of increasing popularity of Harley-Davidson in service. If, in the 90s, only 400 police departments in the United States of America had motorcycles of this brand, today they are in service in 3,400 departments. And this correlates well with the introduction of new technologies into the motorcycles of the American brand, the increase in power and speed, and the improvement in handling. Today, almost 80% of modern police motorcycles in the United States of America are Harley. These days, police departments have access to foreign equipment like the Kawasaki Concours 14. Since 2009, the service has used two versions, Concours 14 Pi and Police 1, 1400, Enforcer BMW R, 1200 RT, and Honda Sport, Touring 1300. However, Kawasaki dealers stopped producing new Concours 14 Pi after a series of malfunctions in the electrical system put 268 motorcycles out of service for repairs. Also, a small number of Victory vehicles can be found in police garages. In particular, in the Daytona Beach Department, Florida, there are some Yamaha motorcycles in Moto Guzzi, California 1400 and Norge 1200 models. In recent years, over 100 police departments have begun using zero electric motorcycles. What are the reasons behind choosing zero and electric motorcycles in general for law enforcement? This is explained by a number of advantages that electric motorcycles have in certain situations. For example, when patrolling parks, urban areas, and similar places. The Zero is lightweight and can confidently handle both urban landscapes and off-road terrain, and its low noise level allows officers to sneak up on suspects much more effectively. However, electric motorcycles have limitations. For instance, a high-speed chase at 140 km/h on the highway will deplete the battery within 100 km. That's why gasoline monsters will continue to dominate the highways for a long time. And since in this chapter we've been talking a lot about Harley-Davidson motorcycles, it's worth mentioning that throughout the brand's history, their vehicles have served in police forces in about 45 countries. And the golden era came in the 1940s to 1960s before the boom of Japanese technology. In Chile, for example, in the 1940s, they used this kind of armored Model U equipped with a 74th engine. There was room for a .30 caliber machine gun in the sidecar. In many other countries of Latin America, as well as in Canada, Italy, Austria, Lebanon, Australia, and New Zealand, at various times people also rode Harley Davidson. Older viewers who still remember the Soviet Union definitely have memories of how they, or their friends, as youngsters riding Voshods and Ij motorcycles, were chased by the stern Uncle Vasya, the policeman on a Ural with a sidecar. This chapter discusses motorcycles used in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and post-Soviet countries. Stop, it's worth starting this section even earlier with the Russian Empire. The first motorcycles appeared in Russia just a couple of years after mass production started abroad, that is, in the last years of the 19th century. And the first two-wheeled design with a motor called Rossiya was assembled at the Riga factory in 1899 under a license purchased from the Werner brothers, who created their own motorcycle in France. Before the revolution, motorcycles were produced with varying success at the Moscow Duke's factory. Despite the fact that the motorcycle already existed in the Russian Empire, it was not a mass phenomenon. Only the wealthy or government agencies could afford such equipment. Between 1914 and 1917, 15,440 motorcycles were delivered to the Russian army, mostly of foreign manufacture. This equipment came both as solo motorcycles and with sidecars. There are plenty of photographs from that era, but there are no mentions of motorcycles being used specifically by the police. About cars. The first government-owned car in Russia appeared in 1896. It was a self-propelled vehicle of the French brand Panhard and Levasseur, acquired by special order of the Minister of Railways. The well-known automobile enthusiast, Prince Mikhail Ivanovich Kilkov, the Ministry of Internal Affairs purchased a car for the first time in 1903. However, high-ranking officials were in no hurry to switch to motor vehicles, since the police were doing quite well with their duties on foot and on horseback. However, when World War I began, the Army received much of the government-owned equipment. In 1917, a revolution took place, and after the Civil War, intervention, the expulsion of the interventionists, and a number of other events, on December 30, 1922, the Soviet Union was formed. By the mid-1920s, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics leadership had begun seriously considering the country's motorization and establishing domestic motorcycle and automobile production. At the time when cops in the United States of America were chasing bootleggers on Harleys and Indians, the Soviet Union didn't even have its own production of two-wheeled vehicles yet. The first motorcycles for the police and traffic regulation departments were purchased in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and it was a small number of German BMW R11S. A little later, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs units and the police received Podolsk Mechanical Plant A750 SAS, which were produced from 1935 to 1939 at the Podolsk Mechanical Plant near Moscow. It turns out that domestic law enforcement officers started with BMWs and, roughly speaking, after a century, have returned to the same BMWs. Motorcycles began to be used on a truly large scale for peaceful service after the Great Patriotic War. Many of these motorcycles had just recently been used for combat missions, and now they were being used by the police. These included Harley Davidsons, captured motorcycles, and domestic M72s. In 1945, approximately 5,000 Harley Davidsons were in service with police and People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs units. By the late 1940s, street activity began to revive. The number of cars, still considered a luxury, gradually increased, as did the more accessible motorcycles. All of this needed to be controlled. The amount of equipment in service was increasing, and the Lend-Lease and trophy vehicles were gradually being replaced by domestic EEM 72 and IZ 49 models. Until 1953, you could find a police motorcycle in almost any color. Order was established only with the Ministry of Internal Affairs directive, which standardized the paint scheme for police cars and motorcycles. That's when the first color scheme appeared, which included a main blue color with red stripes. The models in service, mostly Urals from Urbit, changed during this time. The old motorcycles remained in use as the new models were distributed to law enforcement agencies haphazardly. And in each region, people remembered their own motorcycles: M61, M62, M63, K750, and others, which served reliably for more than one decade.
Yeah, you see, it's the battery again.
I warned you, with an old battery, that's no way to live.
In the late 1950s and early 1960s, motorcycles were modified for police work, with added equipment like radios, lights, and sirens, and some parts changed. For example, some Ural motorcycles were fitted with higher-powered generators to handle all the electrical equipment. They also tried to increase the engine power on this special equipment, and the assembly was done with somewhat better quality. Such motorcycles were given additional indexes in their names at the factory, often the letter P, which stood for patrol, for example, IMZEM 62P. In the mid-1960s, at the Ministry of Internal Affairs' request, Urbit began developing a powerful, fast motorcycle for patrol duty. Naturally, in the context of that time and the vehicles driving on the roads of the Soviet Union, it had to be able to catch up with everything that was traveling on public roads in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Requirements were set for the motorcycle's speed: 150 kilometers per hour for the solo version, and 120 with a sidecar. That's how the in-ear monitor ZEM100 appeared. To achieve the required performance, the motorcycle was equipped with a fairing and used an engine with an increased displacement of up to 1,040 cubic centimeters. During initial tests, the motorcycle couldn't reach the required speed. This was followed by modifications to boost the engine and increase its power. As a result, the engine achieved a maximum output of 50 horsepower, but only with a high compression ratio and gasoline, with an octane rating of at least 85, which was quite rare in the 60s. At a certain stage of development, problems with rubber wear arose. As a result, 3 samples of M-Stow successfully passed interdepartmental tests, and the first batch of motorcycles with sidecars, totaling 12 units, was produced. But the project did not develop further, and MZ, lacking a small batch production facility, was not ready to produce 1,500 M-Stow per year. Moreover, slightly lower but similar speed performance was achieved with the M63P model, which was much easier and, most importantly, cheaper to produce. The documentation and reports were filed away in the archives, and the M-Stow project quietly died. At the end of the 60s, the paint scheme of police cars and motorcycles changed again. According to rumors, the reason for changing the blue and red color scheme to yellow and blue was the increase in road traffic and the need to improve visibility. This color scheme would later become the most famous and beloved by all restorers in the post-Soviet space. In addition to heavy motorcycles, you could occasionally find other Soviet motor vehicles in service. For example, here's a Tula motor scooter in service with the State Automobile Inspectorate. A new era for the police on 2 wheels began in the 70s, because it was then that speed limits were introduced into the Soviet traffic regulations. During this same period, motorcycles began to appear on the roads that could barely catch up with a patrol on a heavy Ural, even without a sidecar. Of course, we're talking here about the IZH Planeta Sport and the new Jawa lineup, starting with the model 634. It was precisely to combat such violators that a special motorcycle battalion was created in the capital's State Automobile Inspectorate, which later became known as the Motobat. The Urals never disappeared from service and were actively used by State Automobile Inspectorate officers, but compared to them, the Motobat officers were rightfully considered the elite. It was for them that new 900cc BMW R90 motorcycles were bought from 1973 to 1975. It is this period that can be considered the beginning of the history of the modern Motobat. By the mid-80s, service cars, which had ceased to be a luxury, had practically pushed motorcycles out of the fleet of the State Automobile Inspectorate in large cities. However, the capital's Motobat still mostly used foreign-made vehicles. In a number of small towns and rural areas, motorcycles remained in service. With the beginning of the 90s, a new chapter in history began. In 1990, the coloring of all state automobile inspectorate vehicles was changed. Instead of yellow, the main color became white, combined with blue elements and inscriptions. In 1998, State Automobile Inspectorate was renamed to State Road Traffic Safety Inspectorate. Despite over 25 years passing, the name State Automobile Inspectorate remains in everyday use. At that time, against the backdrop of a deep economic crisis, employees used domestic motorcycles, which were IZH Jupiter 5 and Ural, and later, in the early 2000s, IZH Junker. Meanwhile, the motor battalion stayed true to its traditions by choosing BMW vehicles. The gap between foreign and domestic motorcycle industries widened, leading to IZ8s and Urals being decommissioned in the capital by the 2000s say. And until recently, you could only encounter these motorcycles in the regions. The capital's traffic police divisions, following the Motobat, also began purchasing German equipment. BMW G650, R1100, R1150, R1200, and so on. Following the capital, other major cities also updated their motorcycle fleets with foreign equipment. Nowadays, the main vehicle used by the police is still the car, but in some divisions there is a place for motorcycles. For the most part, this equipment is BMW. You can also find Yamahas and Hondas. As motorcycle culture grows and more motorcyclists hit the roads, it's evident that two-wheeled patrols will remain active for the foreseeable future. As for the other republics of the former Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, they followed a similar path. In Ukraine during the 90s and early 2000s, police used Dnepr motorcycles from the Kyiv factory and IZH bikes. However, they later switched to foreign motorcycles. An especially interesting chapter in the history of motorcycles in service is the use of escort motorcycles. The honorary escort for heads of state and important foreign guests is not a Soviet invention. Such a phenomenon can be found everywhere in many countries and at different times. Nowadays, in an escort convoy, we are most likely to see the massive and stately BMW vehicles, and it doesn't matter whether we find ourselves in London, Paris, or Moscow. However, things were different in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. If the police and the traffic police from the 60s through the 80s mostly used Ural motorcycles, then in the special purpose garage, Dnepr motorcycles were being polished with wax for the next escort ride. Until 1961, the EM-72 was used to escort important persons. From 1961, Kyiv-made K750 motorcycles were used, and by the late 1960s, the K750 EM and K650 were also in service. This equipment differed from civilian models like the EM-72 and K750. They were thoroughly run in and adjusted. The quality of the parts and the paintwork was higher. The rear seat was not installed. In the front, to protect the driver from bad weather, a windshield with a soft apron was fitted, and the sidewalls of the tires were painted white. At least one of the motorcycles in the group was equipped with additional headlights and sound signals. This was the motorcycle of the escort group's commander, who always rode next to the right front door of the main escorted car. He also had a radio on his motorcycle, mounted on the right side of the rear fender. In the 70s, the political elite of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic tasked the Kyiv factory with developing the Escort 73 model. The project was not easy for the factory workers, but it was ready by 74. 25 single motorcycles were delivered to the Kyiv traffic police, and a little later, they caught the attention of officials in Moscow. By the end of the 70s, they had developed the Escort 78 model, relying on the experience gained from creating sports equipment. The engine for the Escort Dnipro came from the cross-country model Dnipro 750 SK01. This boosted unit produced 60 horsepower at about 7,500 revolutions per minute, but for the special purpose garage equipment it was reduced to 50 horsepower. This figure was enough for the motorcycle to reach 150 kilometers per hour and have sufficient engine reliability. Since even at the prototype stage this model was also planned for export, it also had a civilian name. Dnieper 14-9 escort motorcycles were used solo in the summer, and in the winter with a sidecar that was not intended for carrying passengers, but was specially designed to provide stability for the motorcycle during the winter season. By the mid-80s, the Dnieper 14-9 EM model was ready. The motorcycle was tested and refined for more than a year. A batch of 25 production units was delivered to the Kremlin garage in May of '89. Dnieper served in the escort service until '93, although in winter outings with a sidecar, they were used up until '96, when they were finally replaced by foreign-made equipment. For the special purpose garage in the mid-'80s, prototypes of IZH motorcycles were developed. The first among them was the IZH Lighter, which was heavily covered with plastic panels. They planned to install a rotary two-section ERDA 601 engine with a 613 cc displacement and 52 horsepower output. The engine was developed by engineers from Tolyatti and was largely unified with the Volzhsky Avtomobilny Zavod rotary engines, which Special Services had already had a chance to evaluate on cars. IZH Vega was the second one. Options were considered to equip the Vega with a rotary engine from Serpukhov All-Union Scientific Research Institute Motoprom, or a large V-twin engine being developed at Izhmash. Well, for testing the chassis, an engine from a Dnieper was hastily installed on one of the prototypes. The IZH 821 Vega, with a two-section rotary engine with a displacement of 736 cc, could boast a power output of 87 horsepower and a top speed of around 200 kilometers per hour. For the late 80s, those were pretty decent figures. The vehicle quickly grabbed the attention of the Ministry of Internal Affairs top officials and the Special Purpose Garage. And the creators of the Vega themselves were making optimistic plans for setting up mass production of the rotary IJ and even supplying it to law enforcement agencies of other countries. But it was not meant to be. The Union collapsed and the project was abandoned. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' collapse and the difficult transition to capitalism led to the demise of the already underdeveloped motorcycle industry. The shift from garage-made bikes to imported motorcycles became unavoidable. For the past 5-6 years, the internet has occasionally been stirred up by news that the Kalashnikov concern, which was created on the basis of Izhmash, will either present a prototype or start production of the IJ Cortege escort motorcycle, or even release a version available for civilian purchase. To be honest, the topic is pretty murky. The Cortege, weighing around 510 kilograms in the solo version, features a 6-cylinder boxer engine with 150 horsepower, possibly from the Goldwing. It accelerates from 0 to 100 in 3.5 seconds with a top speed of 250. But for now, you can't see it in the Cortege. However, over the past couple of years, it seems that the priority has been given to the electric motorcycle Auris Merlin, with a 190 horsepower motor and a slightly more modest weight than the Cortege. This equipment appeared in the Cortege in 2024. Do you know what the catch is here? Producing 25-30 motorcycle units is sufficient for the Kremlin garage. More than that is unnecessary. This is not a revival of the motorcycle industry or the creation of a mass-produced and affordable domestic motorcycle. So whether it's 30 Aurises or 30 BMWs, there's really no big difference in that. This will not affect the sectors of the national economy. In this fourth chapter, friends, I want to summarize the information about police motorcycles in Europe. As you may know from history, Europe is the cradle of motorcycle manufacturing. In particular, the most advanced countries in this regard were Britain, Germany, France, the Czech Republic, and to some extent, Italy. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were many different firms and companies in Europe that were trying their luck at creating motorcycles. Many of them would cease to exist after a couple of decades, unable to withstand the competition or facing other problems that prevented further production. At the very beginning, Britain turned out to be the most progressive in using motorcycles for police service. There, two-wheeled vehicles officially entered law enforcement in 1921. However, I do not rule out the possibility that constables used motorcycles privately before that time. The police received locally made vehicles from AJS Birmingham Small Arms, Ariel, Matchless, Triumph, Norton, and other manufacturers. Law enforcement officers everywhere focused on vehicle cost, reliability, dynamics, and maneuverability. However, we shouldn't forget what kind of world we live in. On one side of the scale, we have logic, and on the other, someone's interests. For any motorcycle manufacturer, there's no greater happiness than landing a government contract. Believe me. And right now, I'm not talking specifically about Britain, but about the system as a whole. All over the world, envelopes were passed around in offices, shady deals were made, and the interests of certain individuals and companies were lobbied for at all times. Let's get back to Britain. One of the earliest mentions of a female motorcyclist in the police comes from there. In this newspaper clipping, several ladies are mentioned. In the photo, a woman named Lodge is sitting on an AJS 350 motorcycle, year 1929. The article also mentions Mrs. Rosa Ashby, a former policewoman in 1928, and policewomen Franklin and Byrne. And in this photo, Janet Gray is on her motorcycle, by the way, also an AJS, receiving instructions from Superintendent Shellsville at the Lydney Police Station. 1929. As you can see, at the end of the 20s, a woman motorcyclist on duty was not a rarity. Before World War II, police actively used motorcycles, with and without sidecars, in various configurations. The British Empire was collapsing after the war, and by the late 1940s, people were living with tightened belts. I hope you remember, at the beginning of the story, I mentioned that the equipment used depends on the economic situation in the country. The crime rate, by the way, as well. So, at the end of the 1940s and the beginning of the 1950s, the police faced a shortage of personnel, and foot constables were unable to effectively cover the larger areas on foot. The question of increasing the motorization of the units arose. The leadership understood perfectly well that a classic motorcycle with a large engine was expensive, so their attention turned to simpler vehicles. For simple patrolling, Italian scooters Lambretta and Vespa were quite suitable, as well as locally produced Douglas Vespa scooters. Light copies of the German DKW, Birmingham Small Arms, Bantam, 125 and 150, lightweight British Francis Barnett, 125 and the Velocette little engine, an interesting half-scooter, half-motorcycle with a tiny opposed engine. For more serious tasks, the Ariel 600, Norton, Birmingham Small Arms Triumph Thunderbird, and Sunbeam S8 were used. In the 1950s, motorcycles started being equipped with specialized gear, like radios and signaling devices for light and sound. The Velocette little engine merits further discussion. This motorbike made its public debut in 1948, and over several generations with various modifications, it was produced all the way until 1971. Despite its rather complex, capricious, and expensive design compared to the Birmingham Small Arms Bantam, the little engine was extremely popular with the police. Let's just say this model, and even the Velocette company itself, largely survived thanks to government contracts. How did that happen? Did a bunch of termites just get together and suddenly build everything? No, sunshine. That was all sorted out by bribe takers like me. The Velocette little engine even got the nickname Naughty Bike. Police officers in Britain, when moving around on anything, whether it was a horse or a motorcycle, had to salute an inspector or a superior officer. But when riding the Velocette little engine, or really any other motorcycle, this meant taking one hand off the handlebars. It was decided that showing respect could be done with a nod, called a noddy in English. During that period, all motorcycle police officers in Britain were commonly referred to as noddies. In the late 1960s, the country's motorization surged, leading to a rise in traffic violations and accidents. Furthermore, subcultures such as cafe racers and mods started to appear. For patrol and interception, Norton, Triumph, and Birmingham Small Arms, 650s and 750s were used. However, the motorcycle industry of Foggy Albion didn't have much time left. The Japanese enter the market, producing machines that are faster, more powerful, and most importantly, cheaper. The crisis affected all of Europe, and only a few brands managed to stay afloat. One of these was BMW, Starting from the 70s, their motorcycles filled police garages in many countries. In Britain, they were tested in 74 and adopted for service. It was a success, which I'll tell you about shortly. Of the British companies, Norton supplied equipment to the police the longest and struggled with the situation. From 69 to 76 for the police, they produced the Interpol model, which was based on the civilian commando model with 750 and 850 cc engines. During that period, the company repeatedly closed, merged, or split up. Basically, at the end of the 70s, Norton buys the documentation and production equipment from the German company Hercules, which specialized in rotary engines. Norton bets on the rotary engine, and here the story is similar to the Soviet rotary IJ motorcycles. However, the British achieved somewhat greater success. In 1984, the rotary Interpol 2 made its debut with a twin-rotor engine of 588 cubic centimeters and a power output of 85 horsepower. Later, a liquid-cooled version called Interpol 2A appeared, and then the Norton Commander was introduced. Do not confuse it with the Commando model. The main customers for this equipment were the police, but the number produced left much to be desired. For example, only 253 units of the latter were made over 4 years. The rotor was demanding, unreliable, and expensive, and as a result, the police gave their full preference to foreign equipment, BMW, Yamaha, Honda, and so on. According to the cortege of late Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, his mother,
Motorcycles ER 1200 ERT were featured.
while the British motorcycle industry was still thriving, locally produced vehicles, polished to perfection like the Escort Dnieper motorcycles and other Escort motorcycles, were used in the Escort. And now we have come to BMW. While I was writing the script for this story, I couldn't stop thinking, how did it happen that a company that was barely surviving after World War II managed to sell its motorcycles to the agencies of about 150 countries? And to some extent, they even surpassed the Japanese. Post-war, BMW made small single-cylinder models, but returned to producing their iconic two-cylinder boxer engines by the 1950s. Simultaneously, BMW raced with decent results, and their products were known for quality and reliability. After World War II, there was a boom in motorcycle technology in Europe. Cheap, small displacement, and simple. Simply because most people couldn't afford a car. In the 1950s, BMW was among the few European companies manufacturing machines with 500 and 600 cc engines. Their only real competition came from the British companies Triumph, BSI, and Norton. In the 1950s, they started to gain market share. During this time, European law enforcement agencies began focusing on BMW. Becky had several advantages, including powerful high-torque engines with large displacement, a strong standard generator for easy installation of flashing lights and radio, good handling, and reliability. At the BMW factory, the motorcycles were already outfitted with necessary police gear, such as windshields, radios, and lighting. Thirdly, German equipment was cheaper than British. It would have been difficult for Norton and Triumph to compete. And finally, apparently, the BMW company, interested in signing contracts, offered its customers, namely government agencies, support in servicing the supplied equipment, spare parts deliveries, and other bonuses. Here's an interesting fact for you. BMW organized an event for police officers to train them in operating motorcycles of their own production. These are quite logical methods to retain customers and increase sales. The BMW R50/2 was one of the first BMW models actively adopted by authorities. 26 horsepower and a top speed of 140 kilometers per hour. Impressive figures for a police motorcycle of that era. By the mid-60s, the company was still experiencing a crisis. Demand for motorcycles had dropped, Europeans in general had become wealthier, and were actively switching to cars. Thanks to financial investments from the Quandt family and bold decisions, BMW survived the crisis of the European motorcycle industry. Consequently, internal affairs agencies in countries like the United States of America and Britain are purchasing this equipment, leading to market expansion. Despite Japanese dominance in most motorcycle niches, BMW remained unbeatable in supplying motorcycles to the police. Take Sabika's equipment with all the mounted gear. This factory-fresh equipment is a result of BMW's well-planned policy, which has allowed them to remain the leader in supplying police motorcycles to this day. Approximately 13 to 14 years ago, the figure of 100,000 motorcycles was mentioned. The number of BMWs supplied to law enforcement agencies worldwide has increased over time. However, some tried to resist the German invasion. For example, the proud French, with their rich motorcycle history, by the 70s were left only with motor scooters. And the local Ministry of Industry, along with other bigwigs, decided in the late 70s that it wouldn't be a bad idea to revive the production of large, real motorcycles. A competition was announced, and the winning project was by three engineers, Louis Bocardo, Dominique Favario, and Thierry Grange. This trio planned to create a large touring motorcycle, which, by the way, was also quite suitable for police service, with an engine from a Citroën car. Using a car engine reduced development time, saved money, and also in the long run, made the maintenance and repair of the motorcycle easier. That's how BF G1300 was born. In order to stay afloat in the beginning, the company needed support, and the creators of BF G1300 planned to sign a contract with the local gendarmerie to supply motorcycles. This could help them reach a certain production volume and consequently optimize the price to be competitive. Then private individuals would also be more willing to buy domestic equipment. BFG successfully passed the tests, was recommended for service, and was actively featured in various parades and as escort equipment for top officials. But in the end, the high-ranking officials who had promised to support the national manufacturer went back on their word, and within a few years, the production of BFG 1300 went completely bankrupt. Louis Bocardo, after the 1300, was also involved in two more projects, Moto Française 650, a motorcycle similar in characteristics to our Dnieper and Ural, and Bocardo Aero. Both projects were also created using automotive power units, and each project, in addition to civilian sales, was planned for supply to the police. On that side, everything was ignored. The first project even has a whole detective story behind it. And there is clear sabotage on the part of some politicians. By the way, I have videos about all three French motorcycles on my channel. You can check them out in more detail. The motorcycle patrols of the French gendarmerie ride, BMW motorcycles. I'll conclude this chapter by briefly discussing a distinctive European nation, Italy. The Italian motorcycle industry's history is fascinating. In Italy's warm climate, law enforcement began using motorcycles early on. And you've probably come across a video footage of which you're watching right now. And yes, this is happening in Italy. 1935, a police parade in Rome. The equipment handling skills of these guys are definitely top-notch. For a long time in service, there were many 500 cubic single-cylinder Moto Guzzi motorcycles with their distinctive horizontal cylinder. Until the early 1960s, the equipment was good, but by the 60s, Italy had recovered and the number and speed of vehicles on the streets increased. The once popular 500cc bikes were losing their appeal. Moto Guzzi, like BMW, was frantically seeking a solution to combat falling sales. And the company wanted to continue supplying motorcycles to the police because that was guaranteed profit for years to come. Creating something new was essential. Moto Guzzi engineer Giulio Cesare Carcana in the early 60s designed a large displacement two-cylinder engine for a new modern motorcycle. He initially planned a 500cc displacement, but also experimented with a 750cc engine for the unique Mule Mechanica tricycle, designed with a 3x3 wheel configuration for Alpine troops, which, by the way, was not successful due to its complexity and high cost. As a result, the now legendary 90-degree V-twin engine was born, mounted longitudinally in the frames of Moto Guzzi. Meanwhile, a ministerial tender was announced for motorcycles for the Italian traffic police. The winner had to be a motorcycle capable of covering 100,000 kilometers without a major engine overhaul and with minimal maintenance costs. This was the perfect opportunity to install Carcana's new engine on the motorcycle. In 1964, Moto Guzzi debuted the V7 model. The groundbreaking project merged automotive standards reliability with unparalleled comfort, garnering interest from international police forces, especially in the United States. The V7 engine had a displacement of 703 cubic centimeters and produced a maximum of 40 horsepower. The machine could accelerate up to 160 kilometers per hour. Mass production for the police and foreign markets began in '66, and the following year the V7 became available to the masses at a good price, 725,000 lira, which was much more affordable than its German and English competitors. The low price of the Moto Guzzi was one of its main advantages. In those years, Moto Guzzi was not the only Italian company trying to land a lucrative contract for equipment supply. In fact, almost everyone tried their hand at it. Despite declining light motorcycle sales, Ducati and their United States dealers aimed to surpass the competition. Back in '59, Ducati's distributor in the United States of America, Berliner Motor Corporation, proposed to break into the United States market by creating a competitor to Harley and securing contracts with police departments. To pull this off, it was necessary to create a true muscle bike. Berliner went so far as to send 2 Harley Davidson motorcycles to Italy as examples, one for Ducati, the other for Moto Guzzi. Like, guys, make something similar and we'll have great sales. So Ducati, and not some Japanese company, was the first to imitate Harley Davidson. In '61, Berliner took on part of the expenses, and by '63, the prototype Ducati 1260 Apollo was ready. They even came up with a name that sounded like National Aeronautics and Space Administration, his manned spaceflight program. In the '60s, it was probably the most popular name in the United States. And yes, the number 1260 is the engine displacement of the V4 configuration. Initially, this monstrous engine produced 100 horsepower and allowed the massive motorcycle to accelerate up to 190 kilometers per hour. For comparison, the Harley of those years produced about 50 horsepower. However, it soon became clear that even specially made tires could not withstand the engine's power. They reduced the power to 80, but the tires still wore out quickly. They lowered it to 65 and finally managed to achieve acceptable wear. But this meant that now BMW could compete with Ducati. Apollo appeared at the Earl's Court Motorcycle Show in London in November '64 and attracted a lot of interest. Berliner actively planned to provide equipment to United States police by creating brochures and posters. The price on the United States market was supposed to be $1,500, and Ducati had a chance. But the Italian government, which subsidized Ducati, decided that the limited market did not justify the costs of production equipment and stopped funding the project. A couple of years later, Berliner will see the Moto Guzzi Fight 7. With this motorcycle, everything will be fine. It's quite an interesting story. In the Italian police service, you can find vehicles from the Japanese Big Four, BMW, Moto Guzzi, and less frequently Ducati and MV Agusta. Nowadays, in European countries, BMW motorcycles dominate police service. There are also Yamaha models, with the FJ 1300 being very common. Honda's flagship police model is the STI 1300. What else can be found in service? It all depends on the purpose, starting from simple and low-powered scooters, for example in the police of Estonia or France, and up to powerful sports bikes used to intercept violators. For example, this BMW S1000 race replica in Britain or the Kawasaki H2 in Finland. In this final chapter, I don't intend to go through all the previously unmentioned countries one by one, but I do want to touch on Japan separately, and then we'll quickly go through a few more regions of the world, mention China, India, Latin America, and maybe a few other interesting facts. So, Japan. It's a well-known fact. In the very beginning, Japanese motorcycle manufacturing relied on the achievements of other countries, and many early motorcycles copied something from abroad. Before World War II, motorcycles of domestic production were manufactured in extremely small quantities, and the majority of two-wheeled vehicles traveling the roads of the land of the rising sun were foreign-made. And for the most part, any equipment at that time served the needs of some organization, whether governmental or commercial. In Japan, a motorcycle was first used in police service in 1918. It is known that as early as the 1920s, motorcycles were used to escort the motorcade of Prince Hirohito. Here is this photograph, dated 1926, which confirms it. The motorcycle with a sidecar is a Harley Davidson Model J. Notably, in the 1920s, Japan was Harley's second largest motorcycle importer after Australia. American Indian motorcycles were also supplied during this time. Henderson British AJS Triumph, Matchless, Norton, Douglas, Bro Superior, and Velocette, Belgian Saralea and Fabrique Nationale, as well as Husqvarna, Moto Guzzi, NSU, and BMW. And some of this equipment was definitely used by the police. Mostly it was the most common Harley Davidson. There was a motorcycle company called Meguro, which later merged with Kawasaki. In the early 1930s, they began manufacturing a 500cc single-cylinder engine, reportedly a copy of Birmingham Small Arms. In 1937, the first production motorcycle, Meguro Z97, debuted with a 500cc engine, producing 11 horsepower. The Meguro motorcycle could reach speeds of up to 90 kilometers per hour. In 1939, it was adopted for service by the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department. At that time, the Z97 was the leader among large displacement motorcycles in Japan. After World War II, about 150 firms and companies were bustling in the motorcycle manufacturing niche. By the 60s, most of them would go bankrupt, and essentially, only the so-called Big Four would remain. But mostly these were small displacement bikes, and in the 50s, Meguro was in no hurry to give up its leadership. In 55, the company's first two-cylinder model debuted called Teoden. It was the most powerful Japanese motorcycle at that time. The inline four-stroke twin with a 650cc displacement and 29.5 horsepower output was certainly a copy of the Triumph engine. The T1 was primarily intended for the police. A year later, the improved Z7 model of the 500 emerged, also becoming popular with law enforcement. By the late 1950s, Meguro faced financial troubles after their lightweight motorcycle line proved costlier than rival products. In 1960, the Kawasaki company absorbed them. As in the rest of the world, Japan's law enforcement agencies paid attention to large, dynamic, and reliable motorcycles, particularly to the Kawasaki W series motorcycles. Later, Japanese law enforcement agencies chose equipment based on their specific needs and tasks. The most popular motorcycles in service became the Honda CB 750F in the 1980s and early 1990s, and later the VFR 800P from the 1990s to the present day. In China, the motorcycle industry was established in the 1950s. At that time, the Soviet Union helped set up the production of a copy of the M72. The brand is called Changjiang, and it still exists to this day. In the 1960s, Donghai 750 began to be produced in Shanghai, a motorcycle with a sidecar and an engine that was a copy of the Triumph power unit. The equipment was mainly intended for the military, but it's possible that some of it was used by the police as well. As time went on, the People's Republic of China became the world's factory for producing everything, including motorcycles. The number of companies increased significantly. Nowadays, the Chinese police use quite a large number of motorcycles, from scooters and light 125cc and 250cc bikes to solid flagship models. For example, CEF Moto 1250, J with a 140 horsepower V-twin engine developed jointly with Kate EM. It is positioned as a top platform for police needs. By the way, in North Korea, small displacement Chinese motorcycles are in service. India. At the moment, it is the largest motorcycle market in the world. In 2017, India overtook China in this regard. Now, about 40 million motorcycles are in use there. There is a great variety of police two-wheelers in India, and due to the warm climate, convenience, and low cost, there are a huge number of them in use. The most serious motorcycle you can find in police service is the Harley Davidson Street 750. They are used by the police in Calcutta and Gujarat only in special cases, not for regular patrols. You can also find Honda vehicles, for example, the CB Air 250R, and the most popular scooter in India, the Honda Activa, which is a great choice for female patrol squads. The rest of the vehicles are represented by local brands: TVS Bajaj, Hero, and Royal Enfield. In Latin America, in the mid-20th century, Harley was widespread. Later, BMW and Japanese brand vehicles became popular. However, there was a very interesting case in Brazil with the Amazonas motorcycle. Amazonas 1600 is an interesting example of how two guys from São Paulo dreamed of riding solid motorcycles like Harley, but didn't have the money to buy equipment from the United States of America. Luis Gomi and Jose Bestona decided to build motorcycles for themselves out of whatever they could find in Brazil. As for the engine, they chose a power unit from a Volkswagen Beetle, and the rest they scavenged from the local junkyard. Their efforts could have ended with just a couple of junkers, but then an investor showed up and suggested they interest the Brazilian police in this technology and make some money at the same time, especially since the Harleys that had been supplied to the police back in the 30s and 40s were mostly in terrible condition. The leadership of the internal affairs agencies liked the idea, and between 78 and 86, about 300 Amazonas motorcycles were supplied to the police. But later, the company faced financial problems and production came to a halt. The agencies completely switched to foreign equipment. In particular, I've long noticed that in the 2010s in Rio de Janeiro, Yamaha XT660R motorcycles were used for chases through the narrow streets of the favelas in hilly terrain. Why did I pay attention to this particular motorcycle? It's simple. From 2016 to 2022, I was the happy owner of such a machine, though in the ex-motard version. At different times in countries that did not have their own motorcycle manufacturing, the police used Harley, BMW, and Japanese bikes. And the choice of model and engine size depended on the tasks that needed to be performed. Friends, at this point, my story is coming to an end. For a little over an hour, we have looked at the main points from the history of motorcycle use in the police forces of different countries. Of course, this is far from everything, and if you wish, you can find many more interesting facts, fascinating stories, and little-known models of equipment. However, for a general understanding, I think the information provided is quite sufficient. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If that's really the case, then you basically know how to support my hard work. Share this story with your friends and acquaintances, and leave a comment. And to make sure you don't miss new episodes, subscribe if you haven't done so yet. If you wish, you can support my work financially using the details pinned in the comments. Thanks for watching the Cross Moto channel. See you next time.